Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today to learn about how Food and Water Watch is taking factory farm pollution to court. I'm Tara Heinzen, Food and Water Watch's legal director, and I'm joined today by Tyler Lobdell and Emily Miller, two of our staff attorneys who focus on holding factory farms accountable. We're really excited to see so many of you here tonight to share a bit about how our litigation is a key part of our fight against factory farms. And if you have any questions during our presentation, please put them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them as we go. So factory farms, also known as concentrated animal feeding operations, dominate US livestock production and are increasingly concentrated in certain communities and certain watersheds. These facilities are enormous. They confine thousands or sometimes even millions of animals. And the big problem is they also confine their waste, which they then must dispose of, causing huge environmental problems. These operations pollute in many ways. They overapply vast quantities of waste on crop fields where it can run off into rivers and streams, can also leach into groundwater and drinking water resources. As you can see here, these giant manure pits can overflow, they can breach and cause huge devastating spills. These operations also emit many different air pollutants that contribute to public health problems and environmental pollution. Because the factory farm industry has expanded rapidly and EPA has failed to regulate and keep up with this growth, the factory farm industry is now a leading source of water and air pollution nationally. And we're not just talking about manure. These are not what you think of as a typical family farm. Factory farms, just to keep animals alive, put many pollutants into the livestock feed that ends up in the waste, including antibiotics and other pharmaceuticals, hormones, heavy metals. And of course, there are also manure pollutants that cause a lot of problems like nitrogen and phosphorus that are responsible for algae blooms and fish kills. So this is a huge source of water pollution across the US. In fact, agriculture is now the leading source of water pollution across the US. And again, factory farms emit many air pollutants of concern. These include ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, volatile organic compounds, and particulate matter. And a recent study actually showed that livestock production air pollution alone is responsible for more than 12,000 deaths in the US every year. This is more deaths than are attributed to coal-fired power plants. Now, you might think that our bedrock environmental laws, like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, both federal laws that have been on the books for decades, should protect public health and the environment from this type of industrial pollution. And they should. But factory farms have largely escaped regulation because of loopholes and largely attributable to EPA's failed approach. On the water side, the Federal Clean Water Act is supposed to require CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, to have water pollution permits. This is in the Clean Water Act statute itself. But EPA over the past several decades has created regulatory loopholes that allow the factory farm industry to avoid getting permits. And where permits do exist, they are weak and underprotective. On the air pollution side, we're even farther behind because EPA doesn't regulate most pollutants of concern from this industry in the first place. And it's also failed to develop good tools to estimate what is coming out of these facilities. Moreover, EPA has exempted the factory farm industry from even reporting its emissions of toxic pollution and has entered into a sweetheart deal with the factory farm industry that lets these operations off the hook from Clean Air Act requirements and has done so for more than 15 years. Food and Water Watch is working in the courts on many fronts to hold this industry accountable. And we're focusing on impact litigation oriented towards forcing the Environmental Protection Agency to finally regulate this pollution and ensure that it doesn't pay to operate a factory farm. Today, we're just going to talk about a couple of our biggest, most high impact cases, primarily focused around water pollution. Now, we've identified many issues that EPA has authority to fix regarding factory farm water pollution. EPA can issue new regulations to finally start regulating this pollution effectively. And we actually set out a roadmap for exactly what EPA can and should do in the form of a legal petition for rulemaking that we filed more than 4 years ago. EPA has yet to answer that petition, but in the meantime, we're taking advantage of two main opportunities to push critical water pollution permitting issues in court related to how weak and inadequate EPA's permit system is. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tyler to talk about the first lawsuit.
Thank you so much, Tara, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm going to talk about Food and Water Watch's lawsuit against the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency over its failure to require pollution monitoring in the Clean Water Act permits for factory farms across the country. And so very briefly, just give a little bit of background of how the Clean Water Act applies to factory, how it's supposed to apply to factory farms. So back when Congress enacted the Clean Water Act in the 1970s, they specifically identified factory farms as uniquely problematic sources of water pollution that they expected EPA to rigorously regulate so as to protect our shared water resources. And that regulation takes the form of these discharge permits that Tara mentioned. Those permits establish best management practices, they establish pollution controls, and most importantly, they say the maximum amount of any given pollution that a facility may discharge into waters. So it kind of encapsulates all the obligations and standards that a facility has to meet in order to be in compliance with federal law. Now, in essentially every other context, slide here, please. And in essentially every other context, the EPA requires facility to monitor their pollution. So this is a photo of sort of your classic end of pipe situation, where EPA requires the facility to sample this effluent, send it to a lab, test it for its constituent pollutants, and then you compare that result with their permit to see if they violated what they were allowed to discharge. If they did, then a regulator or citizens like Food and Water Watch can bring citizen enforcement actions to hold that polluter accountable. Now, unfortunately, EPA doesn't do this with factory farming. They have created essentially a functional regulatory exemption from this bedrock pillar of the Clean Water Act. And so part of their rationalization for that is this bogus narrative that EPA has adopted and the factory farm industry has pushed very aggressively, that CAFOs are no discharge facilities, that because their practices are so effective, there's really no way that they're polluting waterways. Well, that is objectively untrue based on a mountain of science. And really just practically, the factory farm system is fundamentally unsustainable and is structurally incapable of not polluting the local environment. And so I'm just going to provide a few photos here to give some visual context to why that is so. So this is a photo of a large beef feedlot. These mounds you see, you might think those are just dirt. That's pretty much all manure. So it's just an example of what happens when you concentrate this many animals on this few acres. As Tara mentioned, it generates this enormous amount of pollution-laden waste that facilities then have to manage. And local environments are simply unable to absorb that waste in any sort of a sustainable way. Next slide. This is another example of how factory farms manage their waste. Tara mentioned lagoons. This is a photo of one, essentially a massive cesspool where the manure and other pollutants are stored before it then gets disposed of on fields. And then this last photo is just of another example of Tara's mentioning that CAFOs discharge in many different ways. This is runoff directly from where the animals are confined. Immediately to the left of this photo is a creek where this pollution is running into. So in terms of monitoring, why is monitoring so important, and why has Food and Water Watch focused on this element when there are so many things that need to be revamped with how EPA regulates this industry? Well, monitoring is the tool that Congress put in place to establish accountability under the Act. So the way it works is facilities self-monitor their pollution discharges, report that out to the public, and then that forms the basis of their compliance with the law or an enforcement action because they violated the law. So without that mechanism in place we have with factory farms, there's zero accountability, there's zero transparency at the end of the day. Because even EPA, much less citizens like Food and Water Watch, are really unable to decipher whether a facility actually complied with its permits or the Clean Water Act more broadly. So, essentially EPA's approach here is that it's created a system where it intentionally fails to track pollution from factory farms. And then it turns around and claims that there's no need to regulate more robustly because it doesn't have information about pollution discharges from factory farms. So it's sort of like this self-fulfilling prophecy at the agency, which results in our waters being impaired. So our lawsuit is against EPA for its Clean Water Act permit for factory farms in the state of Idaho. And Food and Water Watch and our partner in Idaho, Snake River Waterkeeper, engaged in the permit development process. We specifically called on EPA to include pollution monitoring in the permit, explained why it's required by its own regulations and the Clean Water Act, and explained why practically it's necessary to assure that factory farms don't further impair the waters of the state of Idaho. EPA declined, issued the permit with absolutely no monitoring provisions whatsoever, prompting Food and Water Watch and Snake River Waterkeeper to file suit in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. EPA's position is essentially that, we're just going to assume that CAFO operators are perfect actors, that best management practices, the effluent limitation guidelines that Emily's going to speak about are perfect and are always effective. And so we don't need to monitor. There's no discharge, so what are we going to monitor? But as we've said numerous times, that is an objective falsehood. Factory farms do discharge, and monitoring is absolutely necessary to hold them accountable. And so the status of this case, we're fully briefed. The court held oral argument in May of this year, so we expect a ruling any time now and are very hopeful that it will be a favorable ruling and will establish powerful precedent forcing EPA to, frankly, to do its job. It should have been from the start. So with that, I'll pass it off to my colleague, Emily Miller, to talk about our other case that closely relates to this unaccountability feedback loop.
Thanks, Tyler. Hi, everyone. This next case that I'll be talking about focuses on another of EPA's regulatory failures when it comes to factory farm water pollution, and that's their failure to revise or strengthen the water pollution standards that they hold factory farms to in their Clean Water Act permits. So these standards are called Effluent Limitation Guidelines, and under the Clean Water Act, EPA has to set these minimum requirements that dictate how CAFOs will meet those pollution caps that the permits set. So it dictates minimum best management practices that factory farm operators have to comply with, minimum control technologies they have to implement in order to reduce and eliminate discharges. So the Clean Water Act was designed not just to put static limits and controls on pollution that never change. The idea is that industry needs to be continuously reducing their pollution over time, ratcheting down their discharges by implementing more and more stringent technology and control practices as the years goes by. So because of that, this Clean Water Act requires EPA to review these standards called effluent guidelines every year, and to strengthen them if they find that they're not effectively controlling the industry's pollution. So when they do this review, EPA is supposed to look at how the guidelines are working in practice, whether the targeted pollution is in fact being reduced as expected, and whether there's any new, better technology out there that could be doing a more effective job at controlling factory farm waste. The problem is, and the focus of our lawsuit, is that for the past 13 years, so since 2008, the agency has done this review, and every single year has found the CAFO standards are fine, that no revisions are necessary. And this year was no exception to that basic rule. In 2021, January, they made that same rubber stamp determination that no revisions were needed. And our lawsuit argues that that is an indefensible position for the agency to have taken based on what we know about CAFO pollution. So just a few examples of why these guidelines are so wholly inadequate. One, as Tara mentioned, CAFO waste streams contain a lot of dangerous pollutants besides manure, things like pharmaceuticals, heavy metals, chemical cleaning products. The guidelines basically just ignore those pollutants. They pretend they don't exist, and they don't do anything to address or control CAFOs and their discharge of those pollutants. In addition, the guidelines as currently written sanction a whole host of manure storage and disposal practices that we know harm water quality. So they allow operators to store millions of gallons of liquid waste in these manure lagoons. These lagoons are designed to and often do leak into groundwater. They also have insufficient capacity to prevent catastrophic spills and failures like the one you can see in this photo, because EPA's capacity standards are based on 1961 weather patterns, which, as you can imagine, in today's climate, are outdated and don't do their job. Finally, when these manure pits are full, next slide, EPA allows factory farms essentially to dump all of the waste onto crop fields at very high rates, rates that the crops and the land cannot absorb. So that waste just ends up running off into nearby rivers and lakes and streams. So in sum, we know that these guidelines are not doing their job. So you might ask, how then has EPA been able to justify its decision for all of these years that CAFO standards are fine? Well, first, they do so by ignoring a large body of evidence that shows these guidelines aren't working. They even ignore numerous reports and studies that EPA itself has authored, which identify the problems with CAFO waste management and show that despite these guidelines being in place, agriculture and CAFOs remain one of the leading known sources of surface water pollution in the country. So that's one way. The second way, which relates back to the lawsuit that Tyler was talking about, is that the review that EPA conducts in order to rubber stamp their guidelines is exclusively based on self-reported monitoring data. And as Tyler explained, EPA does not require CAFOs to monitor their discharges. Therefore, the data that EPA is looking at drastically underrepresents the industry's actual pollution. This is another example of this feedback loop. Because there is no monitoring, EPA can look at this small monitoring data and determine the guidelines must be working because we don't see pollution being reported. Now that is wrong. The EPA cannot have a review that, one, ignores the actual science and data, and two, relies instead on monitoring data it knows is inaccurate. So if the court agrees that EPA has failed to conduct a proper review and looked at the proper facts and evidence, as they plainly have, then the agency will have to reconsider its position and issue stronger, more protective national standards that actually hold CAFOs accountable for their water pollution. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Tara, who will be talking about the air pollution work that Food and Water Watch does.
Great, thank you both. I think what's really exciting about both of those cases is that they each stand to have nationwide impact that could make it a whole lot harder for agribusiness companies to operate and profit off of factory farms. So stay tuned for updates in both of those cases. I'm just going to wrap up by talking a little about our air pollution work because we're also working to address that. And as I mentioned, air pollution from factory farms remains pretty much entirely unregulated. As you can see in the next slide, factory farms intentionally vent dangerous pollutants into rural communities, and that's necessary just to keep confined animals alive. Next slide. There's a federal law called EPCRA. I won't go into the details, but this federal transparency and emergency response law requires CAFOs, factory farms, to report when they emit more ammonia and hydrogen sulfide emissions than a threshold amount. But in a handout to Big Ag, the Trump administration issued a rule exempting factory farms entirely from this reporting requirement. This is a plainly illegal action that leaves communities completely in the dark about what they're being exposed to. So with several partners, we're in federal court challenging this rule, and our goal is to restore reporting requirements, get communities and groups like ours the information that we need to advocate for common sense regulation of these toxic air emissions. Transparency about this pollution and its impacts on public health and the environment is simply an essential first step towards real regulation. And we think it'll pave the way to real regulation by giving us that information that we're currently lacking. So just to conclude briefly, we've barely scratched the surface of our factory farm litigation, but hopefully this has given you some insight into how we approach our strategic legal efforts to finally hold this industry accountable. And I realize that some of what we've discussed is a little bit technical, but the upshot is that EPA's policy of essentially allowing factory farms to pollute with impunity for decades has played a major role in enabling this industry to proliferate and take over US livestock production. And so the reverse is also true. We think that cracking down on this pollution is a key step towards achieving the factory farm ban that we truly need. So thanks so much for joining us.